everybody, I'm Nick in the States, and this video, this lovely piece of information, will step on a few toes. Sorry, but it comes from love. We recently did a video here, I recently did a video here on this channel for the Gibson M2, which is kind of a heaping pile of junk as they give it to you. I'm trying a series of videos to make it better. We'll see if it ever gets there and ever, gets to be worth it. Whatever that means to you, whatever that means to me, we'll find out. But what's funny is, for this video, even for the for the Les Paul Jr. video that I did, for some of the other entry-level Gibson videos that people say, they'll say, oh my god, in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, Gibson's really falling apart. They're making horrible decisions. Why would they ever do this, etc., etc. And what's very interesting is, if you study the brand long enough, and I'm a dork, and I had some free time, and I have a family of Gibson lovers, you realize it's really par for the course. And some of it's taking risks, and some of it's just messing up, and ego, and trying to think you know things more than what the market is telling you. Which is fine. But going all the way back to 1950, 52, Gibson and Les Paul at that time came out with the Les Paul. And the Les Paul had probably one of the worst bridges ever on it for a steel string guitar, because it was nearly impossible to intonate. It attached to the body in such a strange way. Les had great ideas for how it worked, and guess what? It was really kind of a junk idea. The why I say that is that's a start of, engineering failures. You can kind of cut him some slack in 1952, because nobody was really doing electric guitars aside from Leo across town, and he wasn't doing electric arch tops like Gibson's. Great! But I have a 1958 ES-225, which of course now has a Bigsby. 225 is a very interesting thing too, in that it had a very similar long, weird trapeze, awful, poorly intonating tailpiece on it. Something that had already been replaced on the Gibson Les Paul in 1954, or 55, or 56. Each one of those years I think had different ways of replacing it, from a wraparound to a two-pneumatic stoptail. So alas, Gibson kept doing it. Luckily, you can put a Bigsby on it. It looks all happy-go-lucky when you give it a two-pneumatic. Now, through the same period of time as electric guitars were maturing, they made a couple of other key mistakes. Les Paul double cutaway, kind of a slightly smaller body for a slightly smaller man. Les Paul, trying to also crib a little bit of that double cut mojo from a Stratocaster, really. Those guys came out, as you can see, and they really put the bridge in the wrong place for the strings that would be used then and going forward. And you'll see many of the vintage pieces out there with those bridge pieces doweled and the bridge moved so that it could have intonation. They always had massive intonation issues. Likewise, in the late 50s ones of the DC, the first generation of it, the neck pickup was far too close to the neck itself, and it created a very structural weak point, and many cracked up there, causing Gibson to then move the pickup further back. A lot of people in that time, and even in our time with current Les Paul Juniors, say, it's just a slab of mahogany and a single P90 and a wraparound thing and an unadorned neck, and it's just a junky thing. And yet, so many famous people have rock juniors over the years because they have soul, they have attack, they play rock, they can do a lot of different things. They're a hit, maybe not as much in their own time with the target audience. It was a beginner guitar. They stripped it down and they did things with it that way to be a beginner, but yet it took off. Here's another one, not as many people know about that I would think. Gibson introduced the Melody Maker line in the 50s. They were thin, like the M2, 1 or 2 pickup, single coil pickup guitars in this non-translucent sunburst finish. They weren't too huge of a hit. They had this tiny little headstock. And the reason why the headstock's small, I've said in other videos, is Gibson headstocks really have 2 little ears glued onto it. So that it's one piece of wood for one piece of width the whole way down, and then the ears kind of attach, so that way they're not wasting a larger piece of mahogany. Well, they figured on the Melody Maker to go this tiny little runty headstock to save having to even glue the ears on and save a little bit of dollars there. It looks weird as shit. Sorry for the language, but it does. It's strange. They kept doing that through most of the run, with a couple exceptions. Like the 2014 one, they did a full-size headstock. And the M2, if you consider a Melody Maker, has a variation. It's kind of halfway in between the skinny Melody Maker and a full-size Gibson headstock. It's still very small, but not super tiny. But people are like, ugh. Ironically, the path from the strings across the nut to the tuners is actually straighter and allegedly results in less intonation or less tuning issues going out of tune because of that path and how the thing works. Kind of interesting. A lot of people love those melody makers today, like Keith Urban, I believe, plays one. I think Billy Joel Armstrong, I know, has at least played one. I thought I saw in a video of him rocking out to one. Very cool. Single cutaway, double cutaway, cheap, but they made them then. Alongside the greats, they were also still making these little cheesy ones in the late 50s, and the market on those has really come up quite a bit. And so here's the deal, too. Like, not that Les Paul's always right. Refer back to that tailpiece on the 52. The Les Paul wasn't selling as well, I think, as Gibson wanted, and I think Stratocaster was mopping the floor with it. So they decided to come up with the SG. Two failures there is they didn't get really Les Paul, the guy whose name on the headstock, never liked it, ended up pulling his sponsorship or allegiance or alliance with Gibson over the design of it. He gave his ones to Mary Ford, who he was married to at the time, and she played those, and they became kind of famous in their own right with her. But he hated it. So you've alienated the guy who's really tied yourself to that line, and it wasn't until 68, 69 when they started making actual Les Pauls again. So they just kind of blew that part of the market. SG's caught on a bit, but not to the level that, they had hoped, I guarantee. And part of it was they cheaped out, right? No maple cap, no carved top. You could do a bevel edge around the circle of it. It wasn't designed with that bevel edge to for anything other than the fact that Gibson, the powers that be, knew that Fender didn't have a machine that could do that deep of a bevel around the edge of a guitar, and so they would one-up them on that capability. Not playability, on that capability. But in spite of all of that, the SG actually is loved, played by everyone, Angus Young, Tommy Iommi, all the way up through present-day stuff. It's a loved guitar. I love my SGs. They're really, really cool. The Melody Maker, that cheap guitar, the Gibson shouldn't go to the bottom of the market anymore. Well, they did, and they continued to through all of the 60s. And the Melody Maker started out ugly and got uglier, and, was kind of a dog. But, like, Joan Jett loves her heavily modded one, and I know a lot of people slapped humbuckers in them and rocked into the 70s on them. They're not worth a ton of money now, but they're still a fun playing. They tend to have thick, healthy necks, and, a cool guitar, but was hated in its day, or at least looked down upon. You also have some funny decisions that were made. So this one, my dad gave me this guitar. This is a 68, 69 SG Junior with a little volute. When it actually had a factory stained headstock with actually a Gibson sticker under the lacquer. And I thought maybe there's something wonky with this, and then I did some research into it, and it turns out they made a bunch of these. Once again, try and fail, but I think it's cool. And that's the thing, because it's kitsch, it's different. It's not like every other SG Junior that's out there. This guitar, with its big hunk of chunk of baseball bat neck, is just a hard rock dream. The action never shifts on it, and it wails. And you can still find these for under $1,000. A rockin' fun little, air quotes, failure. Go figure. Now let's talk about one of the biggest, just dumb things to do. During the Norlin era, Norlin owned Gibson through the 70s and into the early 80s. They decided to really cheap out in many, many ways. And I can't highlight most of the failures too well. But one of the main things they did was they went from having a one or a two-piece mahogany back and a maple cap on guitars, usually is how they would do it. They went to having a thinner piece of mahogany, tiny piece of walnut, and another piece of mahogany on as making up the body. So they call those pancake bodies, if you hear that. Why? It'll increase resonance and tone and sustain for days, which is what the 70s rock stars really need. It was way cheaper to build, dudes. Like, that was really the only reason that was done in that manner. It was less expensive for Gibson to build. That's it. That's the reason. So you had pancake bodies. Also, throughout the 70s, you're hard-pressed without a couple of very special editions to find a Les Paul with a book-matched center seam top, or even a center seam plain top. They went with three-piece maple. Why? Because the 70s sucked. It had to have. Between velour, brown, furry suits to get married in, some of the cars, it seemed like the malaise era. That's what they called the car industry in that time, the malaise era. It seemed like good enough. That's kind of how it was, and it's a little depressing. Yeah, it's it sinks. So they did that with those guitars, and they didn't start correcting those sins until well into 82, 83, 84. There's the first regular production looking Les Paul that was set up well. It was the Gibson Heritage 80, and that actually was like the first R9 custom shop reissue looking beautiful, back to basics Les Paul. And those today go for $5,000 because it was just such a pent-up demand for that. Likewise, in the 70s, Gibson came out with a Les Paul Deluxe. Seemed kind of cool, right? Carved, 3-piece, maple cap, pancake bodies on a lot of them, mini humbuckers. And they proceeded to pretty much produce those at a far greater rate, maybe they priced them lower, than the Les Paul Standard. But nobody wanted mini humbuckers. Everybody wanted to be Led Zeppelin. Everybody wanted to be, you know, Jimmy Page or Clapton and Cream or Tony Iommi or humbuckers through a Marshall, but big ones. When you put it side by side with a mini hum versus the regular hum, they just didn't quite have the wallop, the whoomp, the attack. Which is why now when you go on eBay and you search for Les Paul Standard from the 70s or Les Paul Deluxe from the 70s, almost all of them have full-size humbuckers. And almost all of the ones sold as standards still say Deluxe on the back of the headstock. And they were routed out. And sometimes they got the spacings wrong. And the OCD people, it looks weird. Gibson just missed what people wanted, but continued to do that all the way in the early 1980s. So for like a decade, it was like, whatever, we're still going to do this. Ugh. So, it's nothing new what's going on now. I should say, though, people love the Deluxe now. Uncle Funky, you guys might know him from the channel. I've had him on. He's done some video demos. He'll do more. He loves Deluxes in smaller clubs because with his Marshall and stuff, it's more articulate. Where he loves bigger humbuckers, full-size humbuckers, when you're playing outdoor or huge venues, because you can tune the amp more to react to it. But in a smaller venue, loves the Deluxes. So go figure. Once again, ahead of their time or just wrong for their time. Now we get into some rapid-fire, just ones that people don't even know really exist unless you go looking for them. Things like the Challenger, the Marauder, the L6S, the Sonex with a bolt neck. Oh my god, a Gibson with a bolt neck. Are you kidding me? Yeah, no, they did it. They did. They're not really loved in the collector market today, but I've played a couple Sonexes that ripped. They even did they did do a set neck Sonex at one point too. But they just ripped through stuff. And I like the pickups in it. It's evil, it's angry, it's punkish, but it's not an R9 Les Paul. It's not a Les Paul Standard. It's not. It's something different there. And, you know, they've got a history of doing these funky things. The 2015's got a lot of rap, which is 2015 over there, for the forcing everything to use the auto magical tuners. Understandably so, like, give people options. I think then you'll learn really if the options are good or not. They did an RD Artist, which is in itself kind of a polarizing guitar. It's not really an Explorer, it's not a Firebird, it's a little thicker than you think maybe it should be. But they had these Moog Electronics active craziness with a Commodore 64 running the house. Not really, but you know what I mean, like late 1970s technology. And this huge routing cavity in the back. And I have no idea how well they sold then, but you know, now you see them all and they've all been gutted with electronics. And that's why when you look at 2015s, you know, and you see, thank God the tuners come off without leaving any traces that they were there. Whereas like the Moog, you're left with a lunchbox size hole in the back of the damn guitar. As we continue this trip down memory lane, it should be noted that Gibson in the 70s, and maybe it was a worldwide or a US thing, loved Walnut. 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 Why? Walnut. Ugh. And now the used market's flooded with Walnut Gibsons that nobody really wants because they all look at it and remember a stinky bong water stained couch in someone's basement if they were alive then. Or now they're just like, it looks like poop. Roughly the color of poop. I don't care how well the tarbacks in it sound, or the T-tops, or the dirty fingers. If it's just walnut, 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 well, just saying. Gibson also went through a phase of the phrase. The phase. What is the phase? Well, this is the Paul. A cheap Les Paul. They actually called it the Paul Standard. So, like, the Paul is much lesser than just Paul. Whereas normally, like, the King is better than King. I don't know. Like, you normally would imply up, the implied down. This is the SG. Oh, that's just the SG, not an SG. It's the SG. I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me, semantically speaking, but, here you go, man, let's just name it the something, right? Like, people will buy it, whatever. So they came out, and whatever, basic appointed things, but people gig with them all the time. People punked out with them, people did stuff, people wrote stuff. Then there's this, which is a V, with V-shaped pickups. In, I don't know, it's got a lot going on. I applaud him on this one. It's ugly as sin. It's really weird. But some inner Portuguese in me, or inner strange person, it's like, I might be able to get behind that. What you can't get behind, what you would never want to be behind, but you definitely also wouldn't want it behind you, is this. This, my friends, is a Gibson Corvus. Just stare at it. Look into its soul as it steals yours. Because, I mean, ugh. That's a Gibson Corvus. Whatever they do today can never match that. Anyway, here's where we kind of expedite things over the 1980s. Why? Well, it's still a little too close for comfort, and yeah, I just can't do it. I don't have it in me today to do the 80s. And they did some great stuff, they did some funky stuff, they did some strange things that they relegated, like the Spotlight Nouveau, to Epiphone because they were afraid to put it out as Gibson. I don't know. They had the M3, which was like a metal-y guitar. Anyway, it was the 80s. I grew up in the 80s. I don't have a very good perspective on that at this point. The 90s, Gibson started doing cheap things again, like a full line of melody makers. You think one or two's bad? They had an SG, an Explorer, a V, and the regular one, reissued to sort of original-ish specs. They also did melody makers that were just thinner Les Paul Juniors, but they had a P90 in the bridge instead of a little wimpy one. Those are actually kind of cool. I like those. And people complained about them, and they all sold for like $300 or $400, but I'll tell you what, 15, 20 years later, they all still sell for $400, $500, $600. So, I mean, inflation has definitely outpaced that, but at least they're not like a $150 piece of junk. And part of that's why when I bought my M2, I was like, you know what, for the $250 I was able to get it for when they were blowing them out, I know I can always sell it for the rest of my life for $300 or $400, no matter how bad it is. I don't know how great I'm going to feel about selling it for that person, and hopefully they're just using it to target practice against guitars in a Hollywood movie or something, and they really needed a Gibson for it. But that brings us to things like the M2. Gibson has a history of messing crap up, putting bridges in the wrong spot, putting the wrong bridges on it, building things with quality that break, snaps, whatever. It happens. 60 years of history, or 60 years of electric guitars, you're going to get those on there. It doesn't absolve this, or the Firebird Zero, or that entire S-series for their own failings. It's just acknowledging that it's not the first time, and it's not just the last 10 years that that's been happening. You know, even the 2015s, totalitarian dictatorship of, you must have it with this junk on it, but this wider neck you're going to love. The wider neck's only wider, folks, because they needed to do that wide to make that nut work. It's the truth. The wider headstock is also the same deal because things had to actually work in a manner to make all that kind of thing work. That's it. Plus, they wanted to have the headstock different than their good ones. So that way, when you went down to just a shell and made that actually a good guitar, you'd still know that it wasn't that one. So, anyway, I've missed a few. I've missed some. And after recording this is actually when I'll be dropping all the images in. So that means I'm leaving this spot for our honorable mentions. Guitars that I forgot about, but should probably be mentioned. Starting maybe with the United States flag guitar that looks oh so comfortable to sit on your lap and play. And we'll continue on from there for a few minutes while I randomly think about stuff. Anyway, I've been Nick in the States. Yes, folks, I have issues. So does Gibson. And they've had them forever. And they make some great stuff, but when they miss, they miss. Take care. You're still here. You need to go home. The video's, it's over. We've moved on. You should, I mean, you could subscribe right here, or we'll watch these things, but there's nothing else to see here. Just move along.